So I welcome you again, everyone. Hello, this is a new session of the Meet the Author series. Today with Justine Ellis. This event, usually we do, Justine will be doing a short presentation and then we will do a Q&A. In this installment of our Meet the Author series, Justine Ellis will discuss her new books, The Politics of Religious Literacy, Education and Emotion in a Secular Age, from Brill 2022. Justine Esta Ellis is an advisor and a strategist on democracy initiatives. Previously, she worked at the government ethics nonprofit and was an American Council of Learned Societies postdoctoral leading edge fellow. Her research focuses on the intersection of religion, secularism, and public policy. Justine graduated from Barnard College of Columbia University and received a doctorate from the University of Oxford. Her new books, The Politics of Religious Literacy, Education and Emotion in a Secular Age, examines the changing dynamics of religion and secularism in public life. Justine, I will leave it to you, and then we will do a Q&A to discuss the book. Thank you for being here again.
Fantastic, and thank you so much, everybody. Hi, everyone. I just want to say, first of all, thank you so much for that really generous introduction and for convening us today. Absolutely thrilled to be part of this group. You know, before diving in, I did just want to say a big thank you to all of you who are taking time and, depending on your time zone, out of the middle of your day to chat. Especially, I wanted to thank, the Non-Religion in a Complex Future project team, Nathan, Emma, Guada, and Lori Beeman. The non-religion community specifically has been really an academic home to me as I developed this project. So I'm really thankful to the many conversation partners I found in these spaces. And I feel lucky that a lot of you have become close friends and colleagues during this multi-year process. So in terms of scene setting, rather than attempting to condense several years of research into about 20 minutes or take you on a tour of all book chapters sequentially, I think instead what I'm going to do is map some of the main themes and concerns that actually prompted me to write this book in the first place. And I've grouped these themes into 3 categories and kept it alliterative just for fun, because I don't know about you, but I need to find some ordinary things that spark joy wherever I can. So these categories are the secular, the self, and some semantics. And the bottom line is that throughout this research, I became absolutely convinced that looking at religious literacy through the lenses of critical secularism studies and affect theory exposed some of the challenges facing religious studies as public scholarship, and also suggested some new pathways forward that account for some of the embodied experiences and emotional attachments that so often get sidelined in our liberal democracies. And I think religious literacy provides a case study into some of the complexities of the present moment. And with that, I will get started. And I just wanted to begin by saying a little bit about religious literacy, both as a discourse and as a practice. As a concept, it's become really so ubiquitous that I'm really confident that many, if not all of you here, have come across the term. If you want to become religiously literate, there are really a kind of a dizzying array of options that have become available in recent years, from books intended for popular readership to online courses, certifications for students and professionals. These religious literacy resources are basically everywhere you turn. And just to give you a better sense of how religious literacy is deployed, a speaker at a really recent public event described religious literacy as increasingly employed as part of a rallying cry that's based on a particular diagnosis. And that diagnosis is that there has been insufficiently deep consideration of multiple and complex definitions of religion and culture. So if you phrase that differently, when challenges associated with living together in pluralistic societies arise, policymakers and educators often call for increased religious literacy in education, in policy, journalism, workplace context, and many other spaces as well. And I think even though an agreed upon definition hasn't really emerged over the years, one thing is really abundantly clear, and it's that the concept has become a popular buzz term with really lasting power. And we've seen that religious literacy has surged as both an educational and as a civic endeavor. Often it's associated with a combination of knowledge both knowledge and skills needed to engage meaningfully with religion in public life. And this comes sometimes in response to an apparent and often contestants' resurgence of religion in public. So helping people get religion or encounter religion on the ground have become really common refrains. And what happens here is that increasing levels of religious literacy within a variety of sectors and settings has become the task at hand. And often, basically, the conversation centers on how to increase levels of religious literacy. How do you promote it, and how do you have more of it? And very often, participants in this conversation fall into two opposing camps, proponents and detractors. And I say this without trying to paint everybody with too broad a brush, but many fall into the category of advocating for more robust and readily available religious literacy. And then on the other hand, on the other end of the spectrum, a much smaller group finds the whole concept unworkable and undesirable because they either see religious literacy as smuggling in a hidden and unacceptable faith formation advocacy agenda, or alternatively in downplaying religion by teaching it in potentially dispassionate ways. So I found, and this was something that prompted me to examine this further, I found in this tension really troubling. And it sent me down a research rabbit hole examining religious literacy policy proposals, educational curricula, and workplace case studies. And right here, I'll just add a note on methodology. My training is in religious studies, and I did this project from the Faculty of Theology and Religion at Oxford, primarily between 2017 and just into the start of 2020. And while I was doing this work, I thought, surely there has to be not necessarily a middle ground mediating between these two positions, but different ground to cover entirely. So this new book, my new book, which I think as its title suggests, The Politics of Religious Literacy, Education and Emotion in a Secular Age, it makes the case that we need to zoom out to consider what religious literacy advocacy itself promotes. Specifically, what I wanted to find out was, what does the current conversation suggest about the constructed categories of religion and the secular in public policy production? And I use the frameworks of secularism studies and affect theory to think about how religious literacy sometimes functions as state discourse, often advertised as a tool for navigating a religiously plural public sphere in multi-faith democracies. The other thing I will add about religious literacy before talking a little more about theory is that the theme of inclusion has become central to conversations around religious literacy, often pushing back against the idea that religious reasons should necessarily be subordinated to secular reasons and advocating that religious perspectives be taught alongside secular ones. Some, not all, certain proponents of religious literacy argue for fairness while maintaining that the endeavor should remain secular and non-confessional. But something that I found emerging was that despite being billed as a way to create a bigger tent for interreligious solidarity, religious literacy also had the potential and the capacity to invite exclusions in this name of inclusion. So things like promoting democratic discourse, enhancing critical thinking, and improving the quality of public debate are really common refrains in these calls. And just for example, one really influential proponent of religious literacy argues that religious literacy promotes that it can actually promote inclusion, whereas the opposite, religious illiteracy, thwarts understanding and diminishes our ability to engage in rational debate. And I think this emphasis on cultivating a better quality of public reason and discourse can at times overemphasize the role of literacy within religious literacy itself, prioritizing the cognitive, the rational, autonomous, and by extension, kind of seemingly democratically compatible aspects of the subject. So I think such a focus often meant that the feelings, emotions, habits, and attachments involved in formalizing knowledge tend to get sidelined in today's policy conversations. And this is where I wanted to think a little further. So diving into the secular, I'll talk a little bit about the affective turn in secularism studies, just to ground us in theory. And I found that re-examining the concept of the secular provided some clues to the often hidden issues of inclusivity at the intersection of religion and public policy. And what I found was that a narrative of decline at times underpins religious literacy advocacy. as in the decline of religious affiliation, participation, understanding, and even basic familiarity. So the thinking goes something like this. If, for example, religion, bracketing off for a moment what that term might encompass, isn't central to your everyday life, then deciphering its meaning requires training. And a common argument in favor of increasing religious literacy invokes a widespread lack of knowledge about religious tropes, resulting from a lack of exposure to and understanding of identifiably religious people, populations, and practices. So the rise of religious literacy in the past decade or more coincides also with an increase in the number of people who identify as having no religion. And I don't think that's a coincidence. So now, on the theory front, kind of in an attempt to capture this full spectrum of human experience, religious studies as an academic discipline has increasingly emphasized the role of lived religion. But I think recent scholarship suggests that we also need to concentrate on lived secularism too. And I know that folks within this working group and this network are very attuned to these issues. So critical secularism studies and other really adjacent conversations have long called attention to secularism's particularities. And these newish theorizations point out that the secular isn't just what's left over if we strip away religion. These subtraction stories, to use Charles Taylor's phrasing, kind of incorrectly assume that removing religion yields a blank slate. And instead, as theorists like Lois Lee have pointed out, the substantial secular, to use her term, comes with its own orientations, attitudes, and attachments that arise in relation to specific periods and places. And the other thing is that although a lot of the scholarship around the secular has focused on secularization as a process of religion's decline in public expression and an attendant relegation to the private sphere, these recent interventions have called for greater attention to other factors and dynamics. Works from theorists like Monique Scheer, Nadia Fadil, and Birgit Johansson have noted that critical secularism studies have moved from the study of secularization as a political process to the study of the secular as lived experiences. So these works urge us to attend not only to the role of institutions, but also to the norms, the customs, the habits, and the attitudes that inform how we live today. And one crucial way into this debate is through a focus on the body. And this is where I started to see a productive tension in the conversation with religious literacy. So on the theory front, Charles Hirschkind asked in an essay with the same title, is there a secular body? So for him, the secular isn't simply a political doctrine. And instead, he raises the question of whether it's possible to essentially know if someone is secular and whether there are characteristically identifiable ways of being secular in the world. So living in secular ways might be about beliefs, actions, habits, or even the way we inhabit our environment. And these and related considerations prompted this embodiment turn or affective turn in critical secularism studies, which I think has reoriented the conversation towards lived and embodied experiences of the secular. And the other thing is that resources from affect theory, which I draw on in this book, and affect theory, it examines these forces beyond cognition alone. And it suggests that some of our decision-making results from dynamics outside of language and reason. And these theorizations, highlight that our actions, our attitudes, and attachments take shape not only at the cognitive, but also at this visceral level. So taking all of that theory together, it raised the following question for me, which is, does being secular feel different from being religious? And is it even possible to differentiate these two states of being at all? And that's what I latched onto. And now I'll switch gears a little bit and take us into the next section, from the secular to thinking a little bit more about the self, of subjectivity. So this is about thinking about the body and its implications for policy, for practice, and for teaching. So the question of whether it feels different to be either religious or secular has clear implications for education. And this is where I spend a lot of time looking at cases and case studies. And this is especially true in the US, which is where I am currently based. So to keep from, and this is something that comes up quite a lot, that to keep from running afoul of constitutional constraints in US public school classroom settings in particular, educators, what I found, have come to really fear the emotive pulls associated with teaching about religion. And this anxiety surrounding emotion and embodiment can come at a cost. And I think experiential learning within religious literacy is really case in point. And I'll give you an example. Back in 2013, an incident that was dubbed Burkagate, and I kid you not, that it was actually called Burkagate. It caused ripples across popular media in the US when photos surfaced of school children wearing full body coverings as part of a world religions class. So when reflecting on this kind of media-fueled outrage that ensued, a well-established education journalist urged educators to steer clear of experiential exercises because, and this is in her words, putting on religious garb, and this is a quote, comes close to simulating a religious act. Again, comes close to simulating a religious act. So for me, this note of caution really says it all. And the way this plays out, just in this one example, is that both figuratively and apparently literally too, that if you put yourself in someone else's shoes, that can be a really dangerous business. Why is it dangerous? Because if you put yourself in this logic, because bodies and by extension minds can move more easily into the territory of possible proselytization and really constitutionally impermissible faith formation. So thinking and reading in this view kind of maintain a critical academic distance, but feeling and moving mean that you've gone from observer to participant. You've bridged that gap somehow. That once emotions and bodily connections to our environment enter into this calculus, you've strayed from the supposedly safe and contained world of language and text into the messy and really uncontained world of human emotions and bodies. And I think this is a place where theory meets practicing in challenging, but also really compelling ways. That over the years, we've had these ambivalent approaches to the body within Western intellectual history that has really at times led to a privileging of cognition over embodiment and a prioritization of thinking over feeling. And of course, this is not uniformly true, but this is something that how we understand a lot of our intellectual history. And of course, this is related to the dominance of language with its assumed ability to spur action based exclusively on reasoned assessment. So here I kind of draw on Donovan Schaefer's telling formulation, which is what he terms the linguistic fallacy, which presupposes that decision-making results directly from language. And buying into this linguistic fallacy entails, this is a quote, misunderstanding religion as merely a byproduct of language. So this privileging of language can lead to textualism, to an emphasis on the roles of spoken language and the written word. But I think it can cause us to overlook additional factors in our decision-making and knowledge production. I'll give you just another quick example. Teacher training, I think, brings this issue into sharper focus. One of the really early proponents of religious literacy frequently commented in his writing about the neutrality and fairness in teaching about religion within US school contexts. So when discussing teacher training on approaching the topic of religion, this scholar and advocate contends that, and this is a quote, the neutrality that seems morally required here is not one that prohibits the teacher or the text from taking sides, but one that respects the moral integrity of the students by not requiring them to agree, end quote. So significantly here, he emphasizes the concept of neutrality derives from students' ability to make up their own minds based on linguistic inputs and kind of dispassionate reasoned assessment. And I think the statement calls attention to potential cognitivist biases underlying some, obviously not all, but some religious literacy proposals out there. And I think in this understanding, what we see is that teachers' attitudes, whether conveyed non-verbally or stated explicitly, play a limited role in conveying ideas. That reason and individual discernment act as buffers, protecting students from possible emotive pulls. So what we see here is that I think religious literacy, just as a case study, highlights some misleading oppositions between reason and emotion and mind and body and how they play out in real world contexts with real world consequences. So what I did notice was that, and this is an area that really intrigued me and that I point out in the book, is that in a procedural sense, separation of church and state can translate into separation of body from mind. And now I'll round out the last part of my talk with the discussion of semantics, and I hesitate to use that term, but wanted to keep things alliterative. So I'm locked into it now. There's no going back. But thinking about kind of the critical religion critique and the question of category. And now this is absolutely the elephant in the room. And it's a big one, especially in the study of non-religion rooms like this virtual space today. The question of what do we do with the critical religion critique? And there's been this productive scholarly tension between critical religion approaches and studies of non-religion, much of which has focused on concerns about uncritically reinforcing problematic religion-secular binaries. So those who are part of this network, I think even some people on this call today, have called attention to this challenge, and important works from scholars like Chris Cotter and others, have called to bridge this gap between the conversation in critical religion and current studies of non-religion. And very briefly, I think many of you are familiar, but if this is not front of mind, the critical religion arguments, and there are many divergent ones, but a lot of them call for a reconsideration of the category of religion and the power formations it kind of reifies and reinforces. And the idea that religion is not a native category, the notion that religions are both historically and geographically contingent, that religion as a category comes into being in response to particular places and periods really frame this debate. And more recently, scholars have problematized the notion that religion is simply there, existing universally and in ahistorical ways. And in response, some of you have been called for the abolition of the term religion, as I think many may be familiar with. But here's where religious literacy comes in. And many recent appeals to religious literacy come from a place of inclusivity, a response to kind of growing religiously unaffiliated populations. And I think the idea of bridge building remains central to this project. And this narrative of contact and possible need for conflict resolution as a result underlies some of these calls. So the idea of, what happens in some proposals, obviously not all, but the idea of, quote, religion itself, or the complaint that ordinary members of the public are, quote, not sure what religion is, how much of it there is, what it looks like, what it's for, or what to do about it. Or even phrases like the virtually universal presence and influence of religion are common. And these are all, quotes that show, and obviously I can provide sources, but these are all quotes that show particular understandings of religion as out there in the world for our discovery and discernment. So I think bringing in the so-called secular also features pretty prominently in these bridge building efforts. And I'll give you just some examples that people have commented about, especially in the presence of educational spaces, that people need to adapt to the challenges of a world in which religious and secular worldviews will inevitably come into more frequent contact. And this is a lot of the debate focuses on that particular question. And the answer for some religious literacy advocates lies in the tools that religious literacy provides. So, and I'll say, just give you one more example. I think this conciliatory tone runs through a lot of proposals, particularly those from the UK. And one example in particular, I think tellingly, the language of a 2016 UK all-party parliamentary working group on religious education. They put out a report on religious literacy that contains a call for kind of civic and community cohesion that entails bringing together religious and non-religious people. So the parliamentary group recommends, in addition to much more robust interreligious engagement, it says, it's also important to emphasize that many people who do not identify as religious also participate in local projects which aim to improve the public's religious literacy. Further opportunities for formal dialogue between religious and non-religious groups are needed to help people deepen their understanding of others with different beliefs. That's the end of that little section. And so I think religious literacy here serves a particular belief-centric bridge building agenda that, they're advocating that you spend more resources for building this kind of interreligious solidarity. But I think what's also here is that it expands the frontier of interreligious dialogue to include non-religion as a similarly bounded entity. And what I found was that the endeavor of religious literacy, again, not to paint it with too broad a brush because there's so many different and divergent schools of thought within this, is that in some ways it can be predicated on the specialness of the category of religion. And because of that, it risks presuming that religion constitutes a self-evident category with equally self-evident boundaries, attributes, and characteristics. So the issue from this perspective lies in the inability to understand and by extension discern categorically bounded religions. And in this way, extending the category to non-religion also risks reproducing original challenges that resulted from this religion-secular binary. So I think these examples highlight, the presumption that religious and non-religious positions and populations are so distinct and separable that they can be put into conversation on the basis of these identifiable markers. So now I'm going to just wrap up really quickly and sum up and wrap up and just say that, if nothing else, I hope that in this very short time, I've convinced you, if you weren't already convinced, that these policy conversations are worthwhile examining, especially, and I can't emphasize this enough, especially because religious literacy as a form of public scholarship highlights some of the potential stumbling blocks still built into public engagement with religion. And I think, given its prevalence, religious literacy has become this powerful conceptual tool for organizing public understandings of religion and correspondingly of non-religion. So it's important to think about what such policy conversations assume, and in making the category of religion normative and dominant, what power dynamics it configures. So what can we do about it? What can be done? We're just getting started. I'm sure people will have a lot to say on that front. I've touched on this very briefly here, but despite this emphasis on rationality, individual discernment, and deliberative democracy that runs through a lot of religious literacy promotion, there's an often, and this is something that I found, an often unacknowledged move to reconfigure affective environments and conditions in the service of greater inclusivity and democratic sociability. So I think as a first step, let's just name that. And through this project, I started to see what I've termed a post-compliance moment forming. And by post-compliance, I mean that often unacknowledged reconfiguration of affective environments aimed at promoting good relations among people and forming democratic citizens and liberal subjects. So I think, to meet the needs of the present, it's clear that we need to focus on bodies, not just minds. And I would also say that it's time to consider alternatives that take into account this holistic picture. And my hope, and I hope it is not a naive hope, is that this book will play a small role in helping spark that conversation. And with that, I will pass it back to our hosts. Thank you all so much for being here. I really appreciate the time and the chance to speak about this. Back to you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Justine, for that. It was tremendously interesting. I'm really happy to have you here and to do that presentation. So right now we're going to start a Q&A. I see some hands already applauding there. So for the Q&A, you can either raise your hand and open your mic, or you can write it on the comments. Whatever you prefer, I can read it if you write it on the comments. And so, yeah, we open the space for questions or, comments. Well, I can start with one. So, and then people will feel less shy about asking or commenting. There are several things in several aspects of your presentation that I found tremendously interesting, but one of them was this idea. I was hoping if you could explore a little bit more of the idea of the separation of the church and state could also mean a separation between the body and the mind. If you could explore a little bit more of that and fleshing out a little bit.
Thank you, Rhoda. I'm really glad you asked that, because that is something that I came to later in the project as this research developed, and it intrigued me so much that I think it could be a separate project. It could be its own thing. I think there are a lot of productive avenues there. But what I started to see was that, and this is something that I think will probably be very, very familiar to political theorists out there, which I am not one, but thinking about kind of this distinction between norms versus laws, that we spend a lot of time thinking about what laws we need to regulate behavior, and then there are supporting norms, but less attention gets paid to how we bolster those norms. So I think in a lot of ways, thinking about attitudes, attachment, and practice is one way into this. And I saw a lot of productive tension in thinking about kind of constitutional constraints, again, particularly in US context, First Amendment considerations, and then thinking about what that actually means for playing out and what that means playing out in practice. So a lot of times, and this was a question that I did ask in the book, was whether religious literacy itself was something that was being deployed or was being used to essentially obviate the need for litigation. And I saw this especially in workplace contexts, that oftentimes people were trying to think, I think, in very productive ways about how to create better, more inclusive, and just nicer work environments. But at the same time, there was also part of it that was trying to forestall litigation. So I think a big part of this was also thinking about how do you foster environments that are, as I mentioned before, conducive to democratic sociability, and how do you attempt to reconfigure these environments in ways that, again, forestall litigation and create better cultures in the process. So this is something that was, I think, going on and an unnamed undercurrent in so much of this. And again, it goes back to the idea of practice and formation and ways that we're starting to think about how we conduct ourselves in potentially secular ways. I can absolutely return to that, but I want to make sure that there's more space if others have questions. And again, very happy to return to that and have a more fully formulated answer.
Yes, thank you so much for that answer. I see some questions here in the comments. I will read one by Alexander Samusinski. They say, thank you for the great presentation. Focus of my studies is lived secularization. There are specific places where secularization lives or is situated. The Clergy Project is one of them. So I focus on TCP. But what is your opinion about YouTubers that aim to promote religious literacy, such as Religion for Breakfast or Let's Talk Religion? In my case, I launched a similar channel, but with an emphasis of non-religious literacy. Its name, Religiologue. What would be your advice for such YouTubers? What could be their major focus? Should we focus more on religion, non-religion as an effect or a material instead of something cognitive? For example, one of my video is on Donovan Schaefer's book, Religious Effects. By the way, he liked it. Thank you.
So I'll say, first of all, thank you for that question. And I will say, by way of full disclosure and acknowledgement, I feel very fortunate to have been Donovan Schaefer's doctoral student when working on this project. I worked with him along with Johannes Sackhuber at the Faculty of Theology and Religion at Oxford. So Donovan Schaefer's work very influential to me and to my intellectual formation during the course of this project. So I'm very glad that that's out there and thinking about affects. I'd say the advice that I would have, and this is I think a tension that perhaps affect theorists, if there are any in the room, might have a way into this, but this is a source of great speculation about how you teach something that goes beyond text and goes beyond cognition. How do you have these conversations? And I will go, one thing that I had been thinking about quite a lot with religious literacy is simply thinking about, for better or worse, we are wedded to some of these categories of religion and secular. So one thing that might be helpful is just thinking about how we name and how we categorize something or particular phenomena as either secular or religious, and what goes into that calculus. I'll give one example that I mentioned in the book and that really intrigued me. And this was that, I want to say in 2017, but I can check that, but it was a few years ago, the BBC, the British Broadcasting Company, they commissioned basically a survey of their content on religion and religion-related programming. And they ended up with a really kind of conflicting results of their public survey. And it was that people wanted, their listeners and viewers wanted more religion content on religion and religious subjects, but at the same time didn't want the subject matter to be called religion. They felt that it was overly intellectual, it was distancing, it was sort of obscurantist, but at the same time, they wanted more of that content and wanted deeper engagement. So I think we see a lot of this tension kind of coming to the fore in terms of how you present religion and how you talk about it. I think, so I would say advice would be, continue. I mean, clearly the work that you're doing is successful. Please continue doing that and just having these critical examinations. I think a lot of time, and I say this coming from more of a practitioner space, is that there isn't space or room always for the uncertainty and the same kind of critical reflection that something like the critical religion critique would necessitate, because you need workable solutions. But at the same time, I think it is worthwhile to have that kind of reflection baked in, because this does actually impact policy and how people self-identify and self-categorize. So I think it's worthwhile having these conversations. But that is very much, as your question points to, very much an open debate about how we teach affect and how we think about things that go beyond language and reason.
That was great. Thank you, Justine. There is another question here by Leo van Aragon. Given consideration of the body as a way to understand religion, the religious experience and the secular experience, is the distinction between religion and the secular still useful?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that question. Is that categorical distinction still useful? That's what I'm hearing as the question. And thank you for raising that. That is a question that I think many in this group probably contend with quite a lot, and people in non-religion spaces more broadly. I have this vivid memory of being at a conference back in 2018 where we debated exactly this question. And I think people come down on many different sides of this. The one thing I will say is that, when going into this project, that, my aim was for it to be reparative, in the sense that it wasn't, intended to be abolitionist. And and I hope this doesn't sound like a cop-out, but thinking about the productive tension in these categories, I think can yield a lot. And this goes back to, I think, my previous statement, where you think about actually having those moments and having those conversations around how we categorize things as either religious or secular. And this comes into play quite a bit. And I will say, another example that I do talk about quite a bit in the book is, not thinking about how we do this in a bridge building way. And I mentioned this towards the end of the talk, which is, and in the book, I put a sort of a note of caution about not turning humanism into another categorically bounded world religion. There's been a lot of, good scholarship on thinking about the world religions paradigm and how we need to kind of critique that and think about it. But something that I found, and one example that I'll give you, and I believe it's a website that has now been changed and now defunct, but at the time, there was a website about kind of different world religions, and in an effort to be inclusive, it included humanism as well, from kind of a very influential proponent of religious literacy. And if you go through the drop-down menu, you'd have Hinduism, Buddhism, Christianity, Judaism, Islam, all sort of major world religions, and it would have things like attention to internal, very, very critical, and I think very, very reflective of religious studies theory, thinking about internal diversity, that, religions aren't monolithic. But also, as you go down, there were examples of particular core texts, particular figures. And we saw that, and what I found was that on this menu, and again, I believe this website no longer exists and it's been redone, but you had the same drop down for humanism. And there was a similar attempt to find humanistic text, humanistic prominent figures. So I think we have to be really careful about that. And again, and this is something that I point to quite a bit in the book, is that in this attempt at inclusivity, you can also end up with exclusions based on things like promoting the world religions paradigm. So I think we need to continue interrogating that. And going back to the original question about whether or not it's still useful to have these categories of religion and secular, I would say it's certainly still up for debate. We're still using it. And I think a lot of really, really productive new scholarship in thinking about kind of affect can help break down some of those markers. And I'll point in the direction of, actually, as mentioned previously, Donovan Schaefer's new work, which is called The Wild Experiment, thinking about how actually, cognition and language and rationality, that these things run through things that we think of as secular and as religious as well. So that can help break down some of those categorical differences. So I would point people in that direction as well if they want to learn more.
That was great. Thank you, Justine. There is another question by Alice Chan. In Europe, I hear that there is a growing practice of using worldviews rather than religion or non-religion or secular, which seems more popular in North America. Do you think worldviews is more helpful in addressing or recognizing the affective?
Oh, thank you so much, Alice. And also thank you for all of your work on religious literacy and thinking about this. So I really very much appreciate that question. I did spend probably not as much time as I would like, because this conversation was just starting to surge as I was, or I should say, this was starting, a resurgence of this conversation was happening as I was doing the research for this book. But I do talk about it. In one of my chapters, I do spend some time thinking about worldviews and kind of the efficacy of them. And I know that in non-religion spaces, there's a lot of talk about, again, breaking down this potentially problematic religion secular binary and instead thinking about worldviews. And this seems to, as you note, this does seem to carry more currency in places like the UK and in kind of continental Europe. And I would say, I think this goes back to the question of, again, bridge building and thinking about more inclusive ways of having these conversations. The one thing that I do note, I think it's a productive direction. I do present a kind of a note of caution. People, theorists like Ann Taves and others have done some really interesting and compelling work in terms of worldviews. And obviously there are many, many others who I've not named just now. But I think the one note of caution that I did raise in the book is thinking about, once you start thinking about worldviews, how do you make those distinctions? How do you have kind of unanimity among particular worldviews, in the sense that either it's so capacious that it includes so many different people, not necessarily along with, and again, breaking down that religion secular binary, so it can include many other different orientations and attitudes. But at the other end of the spectrum, thinking about a level of idiosyncrasy and specificity that it might lose coherence as well. So thinking about how capacious is your worldview versus how specific to you is it? So thinking about it in kind of intersectional ways. And that was something that I kind of raised a note of caution about in my work, and would definitely welcome the chance to think further about. But there's definitely some thought and consideration about this in the book. And I'm really glad you raised that, because it is something that is starting to really surge in public policy conversations. And I think there's a lot more work to be done. But my one note of caution around it is whether it is all-encompassing or so specific. So thinking about how you mediate between those two.
That was awesome. Go ahead, Nathan.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, my own background is in history, and sometimes we hear similar things about worries about the decline of historical literacy. And I think it's funny, it's usually sparked by something like, there's a poll that says, only such and such percentage of Canadians, for example, know who the first prime minister was, or something like this. And it's usually about, knowing particular facts, something like this. And I guess, yeah, so maybe my question would be, in the same way, what do people have in mind when they're talking about what religious literacy consists of? And does it ultimately just kind of boil down to, like, knowing such and such fact about these particular religions, or is there some more some deeper thing that people have in mind?
Thanks, Nathan. I'm so glad you asked that, because that is something that the question that I had to confront when beginning this project. What was meant by the term religious literacy, because it is so all-encompassing and people use it in so many different ways. So first of all, I acknowledge that it can mean a lot of different things. I think what's so helpful about kind of the term religious literacy, the idea of literacy itself, is that, when I think of literacy, I think of its counterpart in education, numeracy, that there's something about it being a competency, that it's skills-based. And you'll see proponents of religious literacy falling into a bunch of different camps, and sort of some of the typologies that I group things into, and it's obviously much broader than that. But people who are thinking about it as kind of a values-based civic endeavor, people who are speaking about it in terms of content knowledge, so putting together things like a glossary of religious literacy, particular figures, facts, and things that would be very helpful for you to know from a content knowledge standpoint, as you'd mentioned, from a historical standpoint. And then approaches that are more skills-based. So thinking about how you develop these competencies. And something that I noticed, especially when looking at workplace case studies, was often proposals would draw this very clear distinction between religious education / religious studies and religious literacy. That actually people really took pains to differentiate between the two endeavors. And I thought that that was really compelling, because on the one hand, on the one hand, it might be saying that, this is not an educational endeavor. We're not here to, and I say this with some hesitation, but we're not here to bore you with the educational materials while you're trying to do your job in a field that is seemingly unrelated, but you're a member of this global workforce and need to learn how to encounter, difference in productive ways. So I think that that's on the one hand, and then on the other, just saying that actually you're here to learn a competency, you're upskilling, you're here to learn a new skill. So I think that had to do with a lot of the framing. And I'm very thankful to one practitioner of religious literacy in particular who pointed this out to me, where he said that, there's obviously a very big difference between a hook, something that draws you in the door, versus what actually happens on the ground. So I did just want to mention that as well, that a lot of these materials are meant to, get buy-in and get companies to sign on to having these kinds of training. And the one thing I did see is that a lot of religious literacy, the way it was being positioned, was that it was coming in as part of a DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion move, in part of kind of corporate HR trainings. So thinking about how we have more inclusive workforces and workplaces, and there's a lot of productive work being done in that space. So I'll end there. I see that there are other hands up, but happy to return to that.
Yeah, go ahead, Tim.
So going back to the world history's paradigm, okay, which, in K-12 education in the United States, we're still heavily under that paradigm. And even though it's not very beneficial to students, it's really heavily influenced by Protestant colonial understandings of religion. How can you prevent, if the religious literacy is really emerging in the past decade, how can we prevent that definition of religious literacy from also succumbing to that colonial Protestant understanding of religion?
I think that is I'm so glad you raised that. And I'd be very curious about your experiences, particularly teaching at a K through 12 level, that, these are critiques that religious studies has, faced and tried to overcome. And we're seeing some of these things playing out at scale in religious literacy proposals. So I think that this is still very much up for debate. How do you move past the world religions paradigm? And I think the same question is, do we need to? And there are a lot of different schools of thought on that front, whether we need to do it. I think the first thing that I would urge, and I think others would urge as well, is just a recognition of it, that we are teaching within this model, and that as Masuzawa and others have, that this is something that can obviously replicate these and scale these biases that come in from a kind of a text-based Protestant background. So something that we need to be aware of. I think the other thing that I will reiterate is, underscore something that I mentioned earlier, which is that, in some religious literacy proposals, in an effort to be inclusive, that you'll end up bringing in, a humanist figure or someone who's representative of kind of this wider group. And something that I think people in this space especially are thinking about, how non-religion, how do you think about such a broad group that is probably not unified, that a lack of identification is very different from people who identify as, members of a very vocal atheist group or a humanist group. And obviously these are very different types of identifications. But how do you have that unifier among people who by definition are not unified in their identification? So I would call for nuance, and I would say that I think there's a lot of, I hope this is not a non-answer, but I think there is a lot of work left to be done. And one of the things that I do point to in the book is that a lot of times the work behind certain, not all by any means, but certain religious literacy proposals, is that in many ways it's advocating for not just a definitional shift, but more of an attitudinal shift in terms of having productive relations among different people and having, fostering this culture of democratic sociability. And I think the one thing that I do point to and did want to mention here is that actually a lot of religious literacy proponents are very critical of the idea of tolerance, the idea that it's not enough, that mere toleration, it can be, very kind of up on the studies of this, that it can be seen as coercive and hierarchical and really insufficient for having these kind of deep coalitional spaces. And I think as a solution, a lot of what gets put forward is thinking about more kind of horizontal peer-to-peer, and this tends to come in the form of what I noted was respect. Respect is the word that tends to come up as something that this endeavor is trying to cultivate. And the one note of caution, again, another note of caution that I do raise is that in this effort to have, to see respect as something that's horizontal and peer-to-peer, at the same time, a move like that also ultimately rests on the same kind of self-regulation that a tolerance move would also do. So it is horizontal rather than top-down, but it is also based on kind of self-regulation rather than external regulation. So we're rearranging configurations, but you end up in potentially a similar position.
So we have time, I think, for one last question. Leo Van Argon says, I have been thinking literacy to thinking well. No, linking, sorry. I have been linking literacy to thinking well. Picking up on Nathan's comment about history, what does it mean to think well religiously?
I think I would have to, I might have an immediate response to that, but I don't know if Leo, if you wanted to say more about that. I'm intrigued by what you mean by thinking religiously or thinking well religiously. But what I will say is, again, this goes back to some of the distinctions that I tried to work with in this project, which is thinking about that some of the sort of mind-body distinctions and the thinking versus feeling binary that really came through in a lot of this work. So I would urge people to think more about it, but also to name and to recognize that there are different configurations of feeling, attachment, and habit. And the one thing that I will signpost, and I don't know that this gets to your question, and I'll look forward to chatting with you offline about this because I want to hear, I'm definitely intrigued and would love to hear more, is that, that we're having basically this distinction between thinking and feeling. And the one thing that I do point to is that we're seeing a lot of really productive work on thinking about liberal habits. Like what are we trying to habituate in our kind of modern liberal democracies? And I think religious literacy as a case study helps point to some of those tensions and areas for growth and kind of productive further exploration. So I would just add that we need to start spending a little more time thinking about the attachments, attitudes, and habituated practice that we're trying to create.
I will leave it to Nathan to tell you about some information about upcoming comments. And I want to thank again everyone for being here, and Justine for this really, really interesting presentation and all the discussion that we had. It was very interesting. So thank you all. Nathan, I leave it to you.
Yeah, thanks, Guada. I just dropped a link in the chat for our next Meet the Author event happening on February 24th, also at 12 p.m. Eastern time. This is with Joseph Blankholm, and he's going to be talking about his new book, The Secular Paradox, on the religiosity of the not religious. So I've included the link in the chat to register, and hopefully we'll see everyone there. Otherwise, thanks again to Justine, and thanks again everyone for coming and for the interesting discussion afterwards.
Yes, I will just say thank you so much to our hosts, and thank you to everyone who is here. I really enjoyed the chance to have this conversation, and so appreciate all of your questions and comments, and look forward to continuing that conversation.
Okay, thank you everyone, and see you in the upcoming event. Goodbye.